Well, I agree that the position of Indigenous Australians is a great problem nationally for us. I don't agree that they're the most disadvantaged people in the world. If you were to go to Somalia or Sudan at the moment, you might have a different view as to where you would find the most disadvantaged people in the world. Secondly, the great majority of Indigenous people are in urban areas, and they can participate, if they choose, in the economy, in the labour market, or to use the words of Noel Pearson, in the real economy, and move on from there, and indeed most of them do. The biggest problem lies in remote Indigenous communities where, because of a willingness to allow grog to be freely available, to deprive them of most of the supports and services that otherwise in parts of Australia are provided by the government, things had come to a terrible pass. A few weeks ago, I spent a number of days, 3 or 4 days in Cape York, visiting a series of Indigenous communities. I've known Noel Pearson for quite some time, and I'm an admirer of his work and his view of life, but since last I've been, say, in Arakuan, which was 12 years ago, there's been a transformation in that community. A transformation based on, firstly, getting the grog under control, secondly, an initiative by the Queensland Government to set up commissions that can talk with families about their kids and why there are problems and insist on changes being made, and importantly, the introduction of new education approaches which are working at the primary school level in terms of actually equipping kids with literacy and numeracy in the conventional way, with the aim being they will satisfy the same standards as kids elsewhere in Queensland in any government school. And this is called the Cape York Academy, and it's a powerful example of what can be done. And these things are not only happening in Cape York, they're happening in other parts of Australia. For instance, many of the lessons of Cape York are being imported into the Kimberleys, and they're even having an effect in places like Redfern here in Sydney and in some of the other Indigenous communities in New South Wales. The critical thing here is a combination of leadership at the level of the Indigenous community, where in Hopevale it's extraordinary the number of impressive Indigenous leaders that you just encounter in visiting the community, a combination of that plus government that is sensible about its obligations at what it needs to do. So I would commend Peter Beattie for what he started as a response to what Noel Pearson was saying, and I would commend Noel Pearson for how, as a leader, he's developed other leaders, and they've taken the changed environment that Beattie helped create and changed the circumstances of families in many of their communities. The problem's not fixed, but it's beyond green shoots. It's genuine progress, and it's immensely impressive, and it depends upon governments and communities working together effectively.
Hi Chair, Jocelyn Barwick from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
That's the Commonwealth Department of...
Yes.
Oh, good to see you, yes.
Deaf. You characterised John Paterson as offering confronting advice to politicians, and I just wondered if you had any reflections on the best way to offer that such advice, particularly in a very risk-averse environment.
Well, John's most confronting advice, as I recall, was not necessarily delivered on paper. There would always be supporting documentation, and Peter Allan saw perhaps even more of it than I did, but I think John was very good at the face-to-face thing with ministers. And in my own humble career, I've tried to be straightforward with ministers as well, on both sides of politics. And I've lost count of the number of ministers and First Ministers that I've worked for. It's probably more than 30. I've been a CEO in the public service for 24 years. I'm coming to the end of 24 years. And there are different types of ministers. And you find them on both sides of politics. There are ministers who are prepared to listen to an argument and to advice, not try and shoot the messenger, make up their own mind, and then the public servant, knowing that they've been heard, will loyally go ahead and do what the minister has decided should be done. And that's how our system is supposed to work. There are ministers who, as a second group, are sort of a bit worried about the motives of the public servants offering the advice because they don't think that they're necessarily fully professional, apolitical and all that sort of stuff, and treat the advice perhaps occasionally with suspicion. And in the end, you get what our democracy needs least, poor quality decision making. And then there are ministers who just aren't interested in the policy issues anyway and want to spend their time on other things, and in those cases presumably your secretary would be coming to the central agencies, not that this is the case with your minister at the moment, and getting some help on that point. So there are different sorts of ministers, and I think in John's case he was prepared to take ministers on in categories 1 and 2 and occasionally be patient with ministers in category 3. Is that right, Peter? Sort of.
Well, I'd like to thank Terry for a further great contribution to ANZSOG. He has made many great contributions since its inception, and today you've given us a very excellent lecture or oration. So thank you very, very much. And it just remains for me to make some acknowledgements. Firstly, to the conference committee, headed by Peter Allan and aided by John Wanner, Everett Lindquist, Glenn Sheldon, Monica Pfeffer and Tracy Fisher. Also the excellent ANZSOG conference staff led by Tracy Fisher, Sam Hicks, Natasha Mason, Hilda Green, Kenton Malloy, Shauna Piel, Helen Bull, Ryan Hallett, Tracy McPate, Di Burns, Shalane Codbold, Claire Dixon, James Lowe, Fiona Leaf. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, the Institute of Chartered Accountants in Australia, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Arima Research and Cisco Systems. So I want to thank all of them for their great contribution. I think it has been a very successful conference, and I want to thank you also for your participation. And we look forward to having a conference next year in New Zealand on crises and emergencies and governments handling them and what happens after them and how do governments respond. So thank you all very much, and I'm now happy to conclude the conference.